The stars had been silent for as long as humanity could remember, and in that silence, mankind had done what it always did best. It prepared for war. By the year 2187, the human race had spread across the entire solar system like a stubborn vine that refused to stop growing, and they had built colonies on Mars and Europa and Titan and dozens of moons and asteroids that no one had ever thought worth fighting over, until someone did fight over them, because that was the way of things when it came to people. The United Terran Navy was not born from hope or curiosity or some noble dream of reaching the stars in peace. No, it was born from blood and fire and centuries of humans killing other humans over land and water and fuel and pride and 1,000 other reasons that historians still argued about in lecture halls, while soldiers argued about them in trenches. Admiral Katie Tanaka stood on the command bridge of the TNS Leviathan and looked out at the blackness beyond viewport, and she felt the same cold calm she always felt before something terrible was about to happen. Because something terrible was always about to happen, and the only question was whether you were ready for it or not. She was 53 years old, born on a military station orbiting Ceres, raised in the corridors of warships the way other children were raised in schoolyards, and she had never known a single day in her life when humanity was not either fighting a war or recovering from one or getting ready for the next one. And now the next one had arrived, but it had not come from Mars or from the Belt or from any of the usual places where humans pointed guns at each other. No, this time it had come from somewhere much farther away, from beyond the edge of the solar system itself, from the deep black, where no human ship had ever traveled. The Argus Early Warning Network had detected them 6 hours ago, 40 massive energy signatures, dropping out of some kind of faster-than-light travel near the orbit of Neptune, and every sensor station from Pluto to Mercury had lit up like a Christmas tree on fire. 40 ships, each one several kilometers long, each one glowing with a pale blue light that made them look like enormous crystals floating in the void. Beautiful and terrible, and arranged in a curved formation that looked like a jaw closing around the outer planets. The Valith Dominion had arrived, though humanity did not know their name yet. Ambassador Valith Prime Zirathan stood on the command deck of his flagship and looked at the sensor readings with the quiet boredom of someone who had done this 100 times before, because he had done this 100 times before, and it was always the same. You arrived, you lit up the sky, you sent the message, and the primitives fell to their knees. He was tall even by Valith standards, with smooth gray skin, and 4 eyes that could see in spectrums most species could not even imagine, and his long robes were decorated with the symbols of every civilization the Dominion had brought to heel. 214 species across 1,000 star systems, each one added to the collection like a trophy on a shelf. He ordered the communications array to broadcast on every frequency the primitives might be using, and his voice rolled out across the void in a message that had been translated into the local language by the Dominion's linguistic algorithms. We are the Valith Dominion, masters of 1,000 suns and shepherds of the lesser races. You are witnessed, you are measured, you are found worthy of service. Submit and be elevated to a place among our holdings. Resist and be erased from the memory of the stars. It was a good speech, Zirathan thought, dramatic and final and delivered with the kind of weight that made primitive species understand their place in the order of things. Crying or praying or frantic attempts to negotiate, and sometimes all three at once. What he got instead was silence. Not the silence of a species too stunned to speak, not the silence of broken communications equipment, but the heavy, deliberate silence of someone who had heard you perfectly well and simply chosen not to answer. On the bridge of the Leviathan, Admiral Tanaka read the translation of the alien message and then set the datapad down on her console with the calm, steady hand of a woman who had been threatened by professionals her entire life and was not particularly impressed by amateurs. "Signal all fleet elements," she said to her communications officer. "Condition red across the board. All ships to battle stations. Fighter wings on standby. I want every gun loaded, and every crew at their posts within 15 minutes. There was no panic in her voice, because there was no panic in her heart. And there was no panic in her heart, because panic was a luxury that Terran Navy officers could not afford and had trained out of themselves, the way a blacksmith hammers impurities out of steel. Around her, the first expeditionary armada began to move, and it was not a graceful thing to watch. The Valith ships were beautiful. They were crystalline and luminous, and they moved through space like dancers on a stage, every motion designed to inspire awe and terror in equal measure. The human ships were not beautiful. They were dark and angular and heavy, built from layers of armor plating so thick that some of them looked less like spacecraft and more like flying fortresses. And they were covered in scars and dents and carbon scoring from decades of service in the asteroid belt, where rocks the size of buildings came at you without warning, and the only thing between you and death was 6 meters of titanium tungsten composite. They carried no decorations and flew no banners, and their hulls were painted in flat gray. Black because no one in the Terran Navy had ever seen the point of making a warship pretty, when you could use that weight for another gun or another layer of armor. 312 ships moved into formation with the mechanical precision of a species that had been practicing fleet maneuvers since the ancient days of wooden boats on salt water. And every single one of them was armed to the teeth with weapons that had been designed not to impress, but to kill. Zirathan watched the human fleet assemble on his tactical display, and for the first time in a very long career, felt something he did not recognize. A small, cold sensation in his chest that his species had not felt in 10,000 years. His sensor officer turned to him with wide eyes and said, "Ambassador, they are not panicking. They are not fleeing. They are forming attack formations." Zirathan said nothing for a long moment, and then he straightened his robes and told himself that this changed nothing. That primitives were primitives, no matter how many ugly ships they built, and that the Dominion had crushed far larger fleets than this one. But the cold feeling in his chest did not go away. And out in the black between Neptune and Uranus, 2 fleets faced each other across the void, one made of light and crystal and 10,000 years of easy conquest, and the other made of iron and fury and the lessons of a species that had never once in its entire history stopped finding new reasons to fight. Admiral Tanaka looked at the alien fleet one last time, and then turned to her first officer and said quietly, "Let them see what peace built on paranoia looks like." The stars watched and said nothing, because the stars had seen this kind of thing before, and they knew how it ended. The void between Neptune and Uranus was cold and empty and darker than anything most living creatures would ever see. And it was in this darkness that 2 fleets now sat, watching each other like wolves on opposite sides of a frozen river, each one waiting for the other to move first. Zirathan did not like waiting. He had spent his entire career as the sharp end of the Vilith Dominion's diplomatic spear, and in all that time he had never once encountered a species that did not respond to the arrival with immediate and total submission, because the arrival was designed to break the spirit of any civilization that saw it, and it had worked every single time for 10,000 years without exception. Until now. The human fleet sat in the darkness like a wall of silent black metal. 312 ships, arranged in formations that the Vilith tactical computers could not fully analyze because they kept shifting and adjusting in small ways that suggested a level of coordination that should not have been possible for a species that had only been flying in space for a few hundred years. Zirathan turned to his senior advisor, a thin, nervous Valith named Polith, who had served on more first contact missions than anyone in the fleet, and asked him why the primitives had not responded to the submission broadcast. Polith checked his instruments 3 times before answering, and when he spoke, his voice had a slight tremor in it that Xyrathan had never heard before. "They received the message, Ambassador. Every ship in their fleet acknowledged the signal. They simply chose not to reply." Xyrathan's 4 eyes narrowed, and he made a decision. If words would not break these creatures, then light would, because the illumination had never failed, not once, not ever. He gave the order, and every ship in the Valith fleet ignited its primary energy core at the same moment, and the effect was exactly what it was designed to be. Magnificent and terrifying beyond description. 40 ships blazed to life like 40 newborn suns, and the light that poured from them was so intense and so pure that it could be seen from every planet in the human solar system, a wall of radiance that turned the black void white and flooded every sensor and every camera and every viewport within 1 billion kilometers. On dozens of worlds across the galaxy, this moment had caused entire populations to collapse. Priests had declared the end of days, governments had dissolved, soldiers had dropped their weapons and wept, because when you saw the illumination, you understood in your bones that you were small and helpless, and that the beings who commanded such power were beyond anything you could ever hope to fight. On the bridge of the Leviathan, Admiral Tanaka squinted slightly, and then turned to her sensor officer and said, "Filter that." The officer pressed 3 buttons, and the blinding light on every screen across the entire human fleet dimmed to a manageable glow, and that was the end of it. 312 human ships continued advancing without a single vessel breaking formation, without a single communication channel filling with screams or prayers, without a single crew member doing anything other than their job, because human beings had been staring into bright lights and loud noises since the first caveman looked at lightning and decided to figure out how to make his own. Xyrathan watched the human fleet continue its advance and felt that cold sensation in his chest grow larger and heavier, like a stone sinking in dark water. "Repeat the broadcast," he ordered, because surely they had not understood. Surely the translation had been imperfect. Surely no species could simply ignore the illumination as though it were nothing more than a lamp that needed dimming. The broadcast repeated, the same words rolling across every frequency, and again the humans said nothing, did nothing, changed nothing about their steady, relentless approach. And then they responded, but not with words. Admiral Tanaka gave a single quiet order, and the entire human fleet moved at once, like a machine that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Carrier groups split apart and launched fighter wings, hundreds of small, fast attack craft that poured out of armored hangar bays like angry insects from a disturbed nest. And each one of them was armed with enough firepower to crack a small asteroid in half. Dreadnoughts rotated on their axes and brought their main batteries to bear. Enormous magnetic accelerator cannons that ran the entire length of ships and could fire tungsten projectiles at speeds that made the Valith energy weapons look like thrown rocks. Electronic warfare ships activated their jamming arrays, and suddenly the Valith fleet found that their sensors were being invaded by so much interference that their tactical displays began to flicker and distort like reflections in broken water. And at the center of it all, the TNS Leviathan moved forward, 12 kilometers of armored fury, pushing through the void with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a glacier made of guns. Tanaka opened a communication channel, the first words humanity had spoken to an alien species since the beginning of time, and her voice was steady and calm and carried the weight of every war humanity had ever fought. "We heard you. Now look at us." On the Valith command ship, every officer on the bridge turned to look at the tactical display, and what they saw made several of them take involuntary steps backward. The human flagship was enormous, not in the elegant towering way that Valith ships were enormous, but in a heavy, brutal way that spoke of a species that had learned through painful experience that the universe was a place that wanted to kill you, and the only proper response was to build something so tough and so mean that the universe would have to work very hard to get the job done. Xyrathan stared at the Leviathan and realized that he could not see a single window on its hull, not one, because the humans had not wasted space on windows when that space could be filled with armor or weapons or redundant systems. And this small detail horrified him more than anything else, because it told him exactly how these creatures thought about space travel. They did not see the void as a place of wonder. They saw it as a battlefield, and they had built their ships accordingly. His science officer approached with a report, and his hands were shaking so badly that the datapad rattled against his fingers. "Ambassador, I have completed my analysis of the human vessels. They carry no energy shields of any kind." Xyrathan turned sharply, because no shields meant vulnerability. It meant they could be destroyed easily. It meant perhaps this situation was not as dire as it seemed. Appeared. But the science officer was not finished. "They do not have shields, because they do not need them. Their hulls are composed of layered metallic composites. Some sections measure over 8 meters thick, and their weapons are not energy-based. They fire physical projectiles, solid metal slugs, accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed." Xyrathan processed this information slowly, because his brain did not want to accept what it meant. "You are telling me," he said carefully, "that their ships are essentially solid metal fortresses that fire pieces of metal at nearly the speed of light." "Yes, Ambassador. And they have 312 of these ships. 312 that we can see, Ambassador. Our compromised sensors suggest there may be additional vessels holding position behind the gas giants." Xyrathan sat down in his command chair, because his legs had decided without consulting him that standing was no longer an option. Around his flagship, the Valith fleet began to shift and drift in ways that broke the perfect crescent of dominance formation, and the reason was simple and terrible. Individual captains were unconsciously adjusting their positions to increase the distance between themselves and the human fleet. The way a prey animal edges away from a predator it has only just noticed. No one gave the order, no one planned it. It simply happened, because 10,000 years of easy conquest had not prepared the Valith for this. For a species that looked at the most powerful fleet in the galaxy and did not tremble, did not pray, did not beg. A species that simply loaded its guns and said, "Look at us." Xyrathan sat in the silence of his bridge and listened to the distant hum of his ship's engines, and thought about the fact that in all his years of service he had brought 214 species to their knees, with nothing more than light and now he was looking at the 215th species, and they were not on their knees. Xyrathan had asked for the meeting to take place on neutral ground, a small station, or perhaps an empty patch of space where neither side held advantage. But Admiral Tanaka had refused, with the polite firmness of a woman who understood that diplomacy was just another kind of warfare, and that the ground you chose to fight on mattered as much as the weapons you carried. "You will come to my ship," she had said, and the way she said it made it clear that this was not a suggestion. And so Xyrathan found himself standing in the docking bay of the TNS Leviathan, with 4 of his senior advisors, surrounded by human soldiers in powered armor, who stood like statues along the walls, and watched the alien delegation, with eyes that held no fear, and no wonder, and no emotion at all beyond a cold professional readiness that made Xyrathan's skin itch. The docking bay alone was larger than most Valith warships, a cathedral of gray metal and harsh lighting, where dozens of fighters stood ready. Craft sat in neat rows, like sleeping predators, and the air smelled like machine oil and ozone, and something else that Xyrathan could not identify, but that made his survival instincts whisper uncomfortable things. A human officer led them through the ship, and the walk took nearly 30 minutes, because the Leviathan was not just big, it was impossibly, absurdly, unnecessarily big, in a way that seemed almost aggressive, as though the humans had looked at the concept of enough and decided it was a word for species that lacked ambition. Every 100 meters they passed through blast doors thick enough to stop a starship-grade weapon, and Xyrathan counted them as they went, and lost count after 40. And each door was a message that said the same thing. If you breach one section, you still have 100 more to fight through, and every one of them will kill you. The corridors were not decorated. There were no murals or trophies or symbols of conquest, just flat, gray walls and directional markings, and the occasional safety notice written in a language that looked sharp and efficient. And the absence of beauty was itself a kind of statement. A statement that said, we did not build this place to be admired. We built it to survive. They passed hundreds of crew members, and every single one of them was busy, moving with purpose, checking systems, running drills, carrying equipment, and not one of them stopped to stare at the aliens walking through their ship, because apparently the crew of the Leviathan had things to do that were more important than gawking at visitors from another star system. Xyrathan had visited ships belonging to dozens of species across the galaxy, and on every single one of those ships, the crew had stopped whatever they were doing to watch the Violet pass, sometimes in fear, sometimes in awe, always with the understanding that the Violet were the most important thing happening that day. Even the most interesting thing in the corridor. They arrived at a conference room that was large and plain and dominated by a metal table that looked like it had been forged from the same material as the ship's hull. And Admiral Tanaka was already seated at the far end with 3 of her senior officers, and she did not stand when they entered because she did not need to. Xyrathan sat across from her and studied her face, looking for weakness, looking for fear, looking for anything he could use, and he found nothing except a pair of dark, steady eyes that looked back at him with the patience of a species that had been fighting things for a very long time. He began with the speech he always gave, a one about the glory of the Valeth Dominion, the 1,000 star systems, the 214 subject species, the technology that could reshape worlds, the power that could snuff out stars. And he delivered it with the grace and authority that had made him the Dominion's finest diplomat. Tanaka listened to the entire speech without interrupting, and when he was finished, she nodded once and said, "That is impressive. Now let me tell you about us." She tapped the table, and a holographic display flickered to life, and what it showed was not a list of achievements or conquests or technological wonders. It showed a timeline of wars. "This is the First World War," she said, pointing to an entry near the beginning. 17 million dead in 4 years, fought over land and pride and alliances that nobody fully understood. And when it was over, we swore it would never happen again. She moved her hand forward along the timeline. "This is the Second World War. 80 million dead in 6 years, fought because we failed to stop a monster when he was small. And we learned that the price of peace is eternal vigilance, and that monsters grow fast when you look away." Her hand kept moving, and the wars kept coming, after another, each one marked with numbers that represented not statistics, but people. Real people who had lived and fought and died, because humanity could not stop finding reasons to destroy itself. The resource wars, the solar rebellions, the belt conflicts, the siege of Titan. She listed them with the calm, steady voice of a teacher, explaining simple mathematics, and each name carried the weight of millions of braves. "In 300 years of space colonization, we have fought 11 major wars and over 40 minor conflicts among ourselves. We have destroyed space stations, and cracked the surfaces of moons, and turned entire asteroid fields into graveyards. And every single time, we said never again. And every single time we built bigger weapons, just in case we were wrong." Xyrathan listened, and the cold feeling in his chest had become a frozen weight that pressed against his heart. "Your dominion has conquered 214 species," Tanaka continued, "and I respect the scale of that achievement, but I want you to understand something very clearly." She leaned forward, and her eyes locked onto his, with an intensity that made him want to look away, but could not. Every ship in my fleet, every weapon, every tactic, every piece of doctrine and strategy and defensive architecture that you have seen since you arrived in our system, all of it was designed to fight humans. Not aliens, not monsters from the stars. Humans, beings exactly as smart and exactly as ruthless and exactly as determined as we are. She let that sink in before continuing. You built your ships to frighten children. We built ours to kill gods. And the gods we were trying to kill were ourselves. The room was very quiet. Zirathan's chief military advisor, a decorated veteran named Thros, broke the silence by asking about the absence of energy shields on human vessels, because surely this was a vulnerability. Surely this was proof that the humans were not as advanced as they pretended to be. Vasquez, who had grease under her fingernails and a scar across her jaw, laughed at the question in a way that was not cruel, but was somehow worse than cruelty. We had energy shields, Vasquez said, still smiling. We developed them about 60 years ago. Beautiful things. Could stop any energy weapon cold. Lasted about 3 years before we built guns that could punch right through them. So we scrapped the shields and went back to armor, because armor does not have a frequency you can hack, and 6 meters of tungsten carbide composite does not care what kind of fancy beam you point at it. She leaned back in her chair and shrugged. Every weapon system you see on our ships was designed to defeat every defensive system we could build, and every defensive system was designed to survive every weapon we could imagine. We have been running this arms race against ourselves for centuries, and the result is what you see out there. She gestured vaguely toward the viewport and the fleet beyond it. Ships built to survive the worst thing in the galaxy, which is us. Zirathan understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice water pouring through his veins, the true horror of what he was facing. The Valith Dominion had grown powerful by conquering species that had never known war on this scale, species that built one fleet and considered themselves defended, species that fought one battle and called it an apocalypse. Humanity had fought thousands of battles, millions of engagements, an endless rolling thunder of conflict that stretched from mud and horses to stars and starships, and every single one of those battles had taught them something, had made them harder and sharper and more dangerous, like a blade that had been folded and hammered and folded again. Could cut through anything. The delegation returned to the Valith shuttle in silence, walking back through those endless corridors with their endless blast doors, past crew members who still did not look up, past fighter craft that sat in their bays like coiled springs, and the walk felt longer this time, because Zirathan now understood what every meter of this ship represented. It represented a species that expected to be attacked at any moment, and had spent its entire existence making sure it was ready. When they reached their shuttle, Zirathan's second-in-command, a young officer named Selvik, asked him what they should do next. Zirathan stood in the airlock and looked back at the interior of the Leviathan one final time, at the gray walls and the armed soldiers and the brutal, efficient architecture of a civilization that had turned its own self-destructive nature into the most effective military machine the galaxy had ever seen. "We came here to add species to our collection," he said quietly. "I do not think this one fits in a cage." The airlock closed, and the shuttle departed. And behind it, the Leviathan sat in the darkness, like a mountain that had learned to move, patient and scarred, and ready for whatever came next. The quantum communication link between the Valith fleet and the Dominion High Council stretched across 1,000 light-years, and even across that impossible distance, Zirathan could feel the anger radiating from the other end, like heat from a furnace. The council chamber on the Valith homeworld was a vast circular room carved from living crystal, and the 12 members of the High Council sat in elevated thrones had looked down upon a holographic representation of the Sol system, where 40 blue lights represented the Valith fleet, and 300 red lights represented the human ships that had refused to kneel. Dominus Kale, the war patriarch of the Valith Dominion, was the oldest and most powerful member of the council, and he had not become the most powerful by accepting failure or tolerating excuses or listening to ambassadors who told him that a species of soft-skinned primitives who had only been flying in space for 2 centuries could not be brought to heel. "You are telling me," Kale said in a voice that sounded like stones grinding together, "that you flew 40 of our finest warships across the galaxy and failed to secure the submission of a species that has not even discovered faster-than-light travel." Zirathan stood his ground because he had no other ground to stand on. "I am telling you, Dominus, that these creatures are unlike anything we have encountered. They are not primitives, they are predators, and their entire civilization is built on a foundation of constant warfare that makes our own military history look like a brief disagreement over dinner." He transmitted the sensor data, the analysis of human weapon systems, the recordings of his meeting with Admiral Tanaka, all of it carefully organized to demonstrate that humanity was not a species to be conquered, but a species to be respected, and if possible, avoided entirely. I recommend we reclassify this system as a sovereign threat, and withdraw our fleet to a safe distance to establish diplomatic relations on terms of mutual respect. The council chamber erupted in outrage, because the Valith Dominion had not retreated from anything in 10,000 years, and the very idea of retreating from a species that did not even have FTL technology was an insult that cut deeper than any weapon. Dominus Kale silenced the chamber with a gesture, and then made the decision that would change the history of the galaxy. "You are relieved of command, Ambassador. Fleet Marshal Draven will assume control of the fleet, and will deliver an appropriate demonstration of Dominion power to remind these creatures of their place." Zirathan opened his mouth to protest, but the communication link had already been transferred, and Fleet Marshal Draven's face appeared on every command screen in the fleet, hard and scarred, and absolutely certain that what he was about to do was right. Draven was a soldier, not a diplomat. Solved problems the way soldiers solve problems, with force applied precisely and overwhelmingly until the problem stopped being a problem. His plan was simple, and had worked on a dozen worlds before this one. A single concentrated strike on a target of emotional significance, enough to terrify, but not enough to destroy. A reminder that the Dominion could reach out and touch anything it wanted, at any time. He chose the moon. Earth's moon, Luna, the silver companion that humans had been looking up at since they first crawled out of caves and began to wonder about the lights in the sky. The first celestial body they had ever walked on, the symbol of their earliest dreams of reaching beyond their world. Draven ordered the fleet to fire a synchronized energy lance at the lunar surface, and 40 Valith ships concentrated their main weapons into a single beam of light, so intense that it turned the space between the fleet and the moon into a corridor of white fire. The beam struck the surface of Luna with the force of a small sun, and a crater bloomed across the gray dust like a wound opening in flesh, and debris and rock and dust erupted into space in a plume that could be seen from Earth with the naked eye. On Earth, 7 billion people looked up at the sky and saw the scar on their moon, a bright, angry mark that glowed orange against the familiar silver surface, and for one long moment, the entire planet was silent. Draven watched his sensors and waited for the fear to come, waited for the panic transmissions and the desperate pleas and the inevitable collapse that always followed a demonstration strike. What came instead was something he had not prepared for. The human fleet did not scatter, it did not retreat, it did not send frightened messages begging for mercy. Instead, every single ship in the United Terran Navy went dark for exactly 3 seconds, as though the entire fleet had held its breath at the same moment And then every ship lit up at once, as every weapon system on every vessel powered to full capacity simultaneously. The message from Terran High Command was broadcast on an open channel, unencrypted, so that the Vaylith could hear it too, and it consisted of 2 words that carried the weight of an entire species' fury: weapons free. Admiral Tanaka had been removed from command authority during the diplomatic phase, but the moment that message arrived, she was back in her chair on the bridge of the Leviathan, and her face was no longer calm. It was something else entirely. Something that the Vaylith had no word for, because they had never seen it on a species they were trying to conquer. It was the face of a human being who was no longer interested in talking. The Battle of Saul began not with a cautious exchange of fire at long range, but with the entire human fleet surging forward in a charge that defied every principle of rational military strategy that the Vaylith had ever studied. Human ships did not hang back and snipe from a distance the way sensible warships were supposed to. They accelerated directly toward the Vaylith fleet at maximum thrust, closing the distance so fast that the elegant long-range energy weapons the Vaylith relied on barely had time to fire twice before the humans were among them. And then it became a brawl. The first salvo from the Leviathan's main battery was a spread of 12 tungsten slugs, each one the size of a ground vehicle, accelerated to 4% of the speed of light, and they crossed the distance between the 2 fleets in seconds and struck the nearest Vaylith warship dead center. The crystalline hull that had shrugged off energy weapons from 100 species shattered like glass hit by a hammer. Because the slugs did not burn or melt or disrupt, they simply punched through with kinetic energy so enormous that the impact converted matter directly into expanding clouds of superheated debris. The first Vaylith warship died in less than a second, and it died ugly. Human fighter wings swarmed the larger Vaylith ships, like wasps attacking a bear. Dozens of small fast craft that darted between the crystalline spires and targeted the joints and engine clusters with precision-guided missiles and close-range railguns. And every time the Vaylith point defense systems destroyed one fighter, 2 more took its place. The Vaylith ships were not helpless. Their energy weapons carved through human armor, and their shields could deflect the smaller caliber rounds. And human ships began to die too, breaking apart under sustained fire. But even dying human ships kept fighting. A destroyer named the TNS Stavanger lost its entire forward section to a direct hit, and continued firing its rear batteries, while spinning out of control through the debris field. A frigate named the TNS Broken Hill lost all propulsion and used its maneuvering thrusters to aim itself at a Vaylith cruiser and then detonated its reactor at point-blank range. A carrier named the TNS Johannesburg launched its final wave of fighters after its flight deck had been blown open to vacuum. The launch crews working in emergency suits with no atmosphere and no gravity, pushing fighters out into the void by hand because the magnetic catapults were gone. But the mission was not. Fleet Marshal Draven stood on his command deck and watched his fleet begin to come apart around him. And he could not understand what he was seeing, because the humans were taking terrible losses. They were outnumbered in terms of firepower. They were technologically inferior in almost every measurable way, and they simply did not care. They did not retreat when they were outgunned. They closed the distance. They did not surrender when their ships were crippled. They kept shooting. They did not eject and flee when their weapons were gone. They rammed. Of species fights like this, Draven thought. And then he realized the answer with a horror that went all the way down to his bones. A species that has been doing this for its entire existence. He ordered the retreat when the 7th Vaylith warship exploded, and the fleet broke formation and began spinning up their FTL drives. And even as they fled, the human ships continued firing, continued chasing, continued fighting, with the relentless fury of a species that did not know how to stop once it had started. The Vaylith fleet jumped to FTL in ragged, desperate groups, leaving behind 7 destroyed ships and 12 more so badly damaged they could barely move. And the humans let the crippled ships surrender, because even in their fury, they remembered that there was a difference between warriors and murderers. The cost was enormous: 32 human ships destroyed, thousands of crew members dead, but not a single vessel had surrendered. Not a single crew had abandoned their post, and the survivors were already beginning search and rescue operations before the light from the last explosion had faded. As the Velith fleet vanished into faster-than-light travel, a human communications officer aboard the Leviathan broadcast a final message on every Velith frequency. It was not a speech or a threat or a declaration of victory. It was 6 words, spoken in a calm, flat voice, that carried across the void like a door closing. The news of what happened at Sol traveled across the galaxy at the speed of whispered fear, passing from system to system and species to species, like a crack spreading through ice. And by the time the surviving Velith ships limped back to Dominion space, the entire galaxy already knew that something impossible had happened. The Velith Dominion had lost a battle. Not a skirmish, not a minor engagement on the edge of their territory, but a full fleet action against a species that did not even have faster-than-light travel. A species that the Dominion had classified as primitive and scheduled for integration and had expected to conquer in an afternoon. The effect was like pulling a single stone from the base of a wall that had stood for 10,000 years. On the world called Thessera Prime, where the insectoid Thesserae had served the Dominion for 800 years, the worker caste stopped working. They set down their tools and stood in the streets, their industrial cities, and looked up at the sky and wondered for the first time in generations whether the ceiling above them was actually a sky or just the bottom of someone else's boot. On the ocean world of Delphis, where the aquatic Delphani had been harvested for their bioluminescent compounds since before most species in the galaxy had invented language, the deep-sea colonies began refusing to surface for collection, and when the Velith overseers sent automated drones to force compliance, they found that the drones had been dismantled and repurposed into something that looked very much like weapons. On 100 other worlds across the Dominion, species that had been quiet and obedient for centuries suddenly remembered that they had not always been quiet and obedient, and the memory burned like a fire that had been banked for too long and was now catching on dry wood. The Dominion High Council was in chaos. Dominus Kale stood before the council and raged about treachery and incompetence, and the need to assemble the Grand Armada and return to Sol with 1,000 ships and burn the human homeworld to ash. But his voice had lost the authority it once carried, because everyone in the chamber knew that he was the one who had ordered the strike on the moon. He was the one who had overruled Xyrathan. He was the one who had turned a standoff into a disaster. Xyrathan himself was in a holding cell beneath the council chamber, imprisoned for the crime of being right, which was a crime that governments across the galaxy had been punishing since the beginning of organized civilization. A guard came to his cell and told him that the council wanted him to provide a strategic assessment of humanity's likely next move. And Xyrathan laughed, which was a sound that the guard had never heard a prisoner make before. "Their next move," Xyrathan said, "is the same move they have made after every war in their history. Learned from their enemy, and they will use it to become stronger. They are probably studying our wrecked ships right now, and within a season they will have faster-than-light travel. And then you will have a very different problem on your hands." The guard reported this to the council, and the council did not want to believe it. But 3 weeks later, the first human ship appeared outside Dominion space. It was not a warship, or rather it was not only a warship, it was a research vessel that had been retrofitted with an FTL drive, reverse-engineered from the wreckage of a Velith cruiser, and it sat just beyond the Dominion border, like a cat sitting just outside a mouse hole, not attacking, not advancing, just watching with patient, interested eyes. Then another ship appeared, and another, and within a month There were dozens of human vessels scattered along the Dominion frontier, dark angular shapes that hung in the void and did absolutely nothing except exist. Their existence was terrifying, because the Valith understood what it meant. It meant that humanity had taken the Dominion's greatest technological advantage, faster than light travel, and had claimed it for themselves in less than a month. And if they could do that with FTL, then they could do it with anything. They would pick apart Valith technology like children disassembling a toy, and everything they learned they would use to build something harder and meaner and more dangerous than the original. On Earth, the aftermath of the battle was complicated in the way that human things were always complicated, because humanity could not even agree on how to feel about the greatest military victory in the history of the species. Some wanted isolation. They wanted to seal the solar system and build a wall of ships and guns around their home and never let anything in or out, because the galaxy had proven itself to be a dangerous place, and the safest thing to do with dangerous places was to stay away from them. Others wanted expansion. They wanted to push out into the galaxy and find the species the Dominion had conquered and free them, because humanity had a long and complicated history with the concept of liberation that included both genuine heroism and terrible hypocrisy. And apparently even contact with alien civilizations could not settle the argument. Admiral Tanaka stood before the Terran Assembly and argued for a middle path, and her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen the cost of the battle up close, and was not interested in grand gestures or noble speeches, but only in the survival and prosperity of the species she had sworn to protect. "We will not conquer," she said, "because we know what conquest does to the conquered and to the conqueror. And we will not hide, because we know what hiding does to a species that was born to explore. We will stand where we are, and we will build, and we will watch. We will make it very clear to anyone who looks in our direction that we are not prey, and we are not predators. We are something the galaxy has not seen before, and we will define for ourselves what that means." The assembly voted, and the vote was not unanimous, because human votes never were. But the majority agreed, and the policy of armed diplomacy became the official position of the United Terran government. 3 months after the Battle of Sol, a single Valith ship appeared at the edge of the solar system, and it was not a warship. It was a diplomatic vessel, small and unarmed, and broadcasting a signal of peaceful intent on every frequency. Xyrathan was aboard. He had been freed from his cell by a faction within the Dominion that had finally realized he was the only Valith alive who understood humanity well enough to talk to them without getting everyone killed. And they had sent him back to Sol with the authority to negotiate a treaty, not of submission, but of recognition. He met with Admiral Tanaka one final time aboard the Leviathan, which was still scarred from the battle, its hull marked with burns and impact craters that the repair crews had not yet gotten around to fixing, because there was always something more important to fix first. They sat across from each other at the same metal table where they had first spoken, and Xyrathan noticed that Tanaka looked tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. She looked like a woman who had done something necessary and terrible, and was still carrying the weight of it. "I have a question," Xyrathan said, "one that has kept me awake since the day I first set foot on this ship." Tanaka nodded for him to continue. "How does your species live with so much violence inside you? How do you build and create and love and dream when you carry within you the capacity for such destruction? Does it not consume you?" Tanaka was quiet for a long time. Her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "We do not live with it," she said. "We build with it. Every ship in my fleet, every city on Earth, every law and institution and tradition that keeps our civilization from tearing itself apart. All of it is scaffolding around the thing inside us that wants to burn everything down. We did not tame it. We did not conquer it. We put it to work. And every day we wake up and we choose to build instead of destroy. And some days that choice is harder than others. But we make it anyway, because the alternative is to become the thing we are most afraid of, which is ourselves with nothing left to lose. Zirathan sat with this answer for a long time, turning it over in his mind the way one turns over a stone that might be a gem or might be a weapon. Then he proposed the treaty, and it was simple, because the best treaties always were. The Valith Dominion would release the species nearest to human space as a gesture of good faith. The humans would not advance further into Dominion territory, and both sides would establish diplomatic channels and trade agreements, and begin the slow, difficult process of learning to exist in the same galaxy without killing each other. Tanaka accepted, and they pressed their hands together in a gesture that meant nothing in either culture, but felt right anyway, the way some things do when two beings who were once enemies decide to try being something else. 1 week later, deep in the archives of the Valith homeworld, a librarian made a small change to a very old database. The entry for the Sol system had read uncontacted primitive, scheduled for integration, since a Valith survey probe had first detected human radio signals 2 centuries ago, and this designation had remained unchanged through all the years of silence that followed. The librarian deleted the entry and replaced it with a single word, a classification that existed in the Valith records. Only twice before, in their entire million-year history, the word was equal. The librarian stared at the screen for a moment, then saved the file and moved on, because there was other work to do, and the galaxy was a busy place. And somewhere in the black, far from Earth, and far from the Dominion, and far from the ancient arguments of species that thought they knew how the universe worked, a human cargo freighter crossed into deep space for the first time. It was not a pretty ship. It was boxy and scarred, and held together in places by patches that had been welded on by hand. And it carried grain and medical supplies and machine parts bound for a Thesari colony that had just declared its independence and needed everything. But it was also armed to the teeth, because even the freighters were armed, because this was a human ship, and humans did not send anything into the unknown without giving it the means to fight its way back home. Woman named Chen, and she had never been this far from Earth before, and the stars outside her viewport were strange and unfamiliar, and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. She grinned and leaned back in her chair and opened a channel to her crew. "All right, everyone. New territory, eyes open, guns ready, and let's go make some friends." The freighter's engines flared, and it vanished into the dark between the stars, carrying with it the restless, stubborn, violent, hopeful spirit of a species that had spent its entire existence fighting itself, and had finally found something bitter to reach for. The galaxy had no idea what it had just woken up, but it was about to find out.